actually learn? In a way, nothing. Do not take a drink every time I say the word methodology in this video. Hi, my name is EK and welcome to my channel Explain, where in this video I want to talk about my master's experience. Some of my friends are currently starting their masters, others are preparing to start next year, and others are in the process of applying. So I wanted to outline my kind of general master's experience for those who are either in the process of or thinking of applying, or are just kind of nosy. So between 2014 and 2020, I studied part-time an undergraduate degree with the Open University in history, where I achieved a first-class classification. In September 2020, I began my master's degree with the University of Edinburgh, studying again part-time over 2 years. I finished the course in August 2022, also with a first-class classification, and I will be having a graduation ceremony this winter. Most of the time, the classification that you receive for your degree does not matter, but I got my master's degree result like 2 weeks ago. So I'm allowed this time to gloat. For my master's degree, I completed 6 different classes or courses. 2 of them were compulsory and the rest were optional. Each were assessed by an essay of between 4,000 and 5,000 words. And finally, I had a dissertation of 15,000 words. The actual topic of these essays, like the title or the question, I came up with myself. It's kind of one of the novel things about master's degrees, at least in the UK, is that you're coming up with the topics for your own essays. When I was doing my undergrad, I was very excited about this prospect because throughout my entire undergrad we were given the questions. Sometimes we would be given a few and were able to pick them, but they were all kind of assigned. And then when I was completing my master's degree, how I longed for the days of undergrad where somebody else did that for me. The way it worked at Edinburgh, we would have around 10 weeks of class per course. We would be given chapters or articles, kind of general readings to read in advance for the class, and we would then discuss those readings in the class seminars. For some classes there was a lot of reading, up to and above 100 pages a week. But in some there were far less. One of my courses there was a really long list of readings, which did strike fear into my heart, but the professor divided them up and kind of assigned 1 per person or 1 per 2 people, and then you would read that and kind of feed back to the class. Towards the end of those 10 weeks, you would then draw on the materials that you had covered and kind of the topics that you had gone through in class to formulate an essay idea with your professor, and then you would kind of discuss it back and forth, usually over email, to figure out your overall essay approach. As I said, we had 6 courses and 1 dissertation. 2 of those courses were compulsory for all students on the kind of history program, and those were skills and sources and methodology. I'm going to go through all of the classes that I did, including the essays that I wrote, to just kind of give you an idea of how it might look. Both the compulsory courses were divided into 4-week pathways, of which you would take 2, one after the other. Each of the pathways was a different topic. There were quite a range of both kind of fields and eras of history. For skills and sources, I first chose medieval narratives pathway, and then witchcraft, confessions, and then wrote my essay based on the medieval narratives portion. Both pathways, like this entire class, focused on skills of historical analysis and understanding of historiography, by which I mean the ways that history is kind of taught, understood, and interpreted. My essay looked at the spiritual biography, or vita, of St. Margaret of Scotland, and where the kind of scientific style historical approaches which seek unendingly for some kind of supposedly objective factual truth in historical sources, I was looking at how useful those approaches were for that vita specifically. The answer was not very useful. I actually did my skills and sources course in semester 1 of my first year, and then in semester 2 of my first year, so after Christmas. The first one I did was methodology, another compulsory course, and then one on sources on women in late medieval England. For the methodology course, we again had the pathways thing, and I first studied landscape and memory, which was very kind of 20th century, so I knew I wasn't going to write my essay on that. And then the next one was sexuality before modernity. This course focused like even more so on historiography, There was definitely overlap between skills and sources and this, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. For my essay, I explored kind of methodologies around queerness through a focus on Radegund of Poitiers, who was a 6th century saint, and asked whether we can consider her queer based on kind of the history of sexuality. The sexuality before modernity one was a lot of fun. We were still in kind of COVID lockdown at this point, so it was all on, I think we used Microsoft Teams, and like we had our little, you know, the little grid with all our faces, and we all looked exactly the same. I'm not wearing my glasses at the moment because they reflect, so I've got my lenses in, but I have, you know, the gay owl librarian glasses, as did most of the other people in that class. But it was a lovely class. It was good. It was very interesting. During that second semester while I was studying the methodology course, I also took the class on sources on women in late medieval England. So this looks at women in late medieval England, but primarily the different ways that we know about them. For example, we looked at legal records from marriage courts, letters from women, like the Pastons, conduct books that were aimed at kind of inculcating respectable behaviour in young ladies, stories about saints, particularly virgin martyrs, who were often presented didactically as kind of inspirational heroines for young women. And based on these sources, I specifically focused on manorial court records. So a manor was like a rural unit. You had like the lord of the manor, and then people who kind of worked the land in a feudal relationship. But I used these sources amongst others to kind of evaluate the position of rural widows in late medieval England and consider whether we can speak of them as liberated or otherwise, before kind of briefly discussing on whether liberation is too anachronistic to talk about, etc, etc. This was definitely like my most boring kind of, not boring, but it was like very straightforward, very cut and dry. Whereas like some of the other essays I wrote were fucking wild. Like in the first one, the first St. Margaret one, I argued that truth was completely irrelevant. In the sexuality one, I argued that this 6th century nun was actually queer. And in the next two, I argued that the Renaissance didn't exist and that masculinity was completely made up by everybody involved. So yeah, my women in late medieval England was more pedestrian. Speaking of the Renaissance not existing, in semester 1 of year 2 I studied the global Renaissance, which very much was a big gear change for me because it took lots of things that I had encountered kind of through my undergrad study, so the medieval period, the idea of the Renaissance, colonization and exploration by Europeans of places like the Americas and Africa and Asia. It kind of put all of those things in a hat, shook them around, and then dumped them out onto the table. It was looking at things that I already knew about and thinking of them in a completely different light. Essentially, the class combined methodologies. Do not take a drink every time I say the word methodology in this video. Essentially, this class combined methodologies of global history and kind of traditional and new understandings of the Renaissance, and asked like, what was the impact of the wider world on the European Renaissance? What was the impact of the European Renaissance on the wider world? Did other places have a Renaissance apart from Europe? Should we re-envision the Renaissance as a result? And this isn't because I'm contrarian. This is mostly not because I'm contrarian, but because I have focused so much on the medieval period as my study has kind of gone on. I feel I have enhanced my appreciation and understanding of the medieval period. As a result, I am very critical of the idea of the historiographical concept of the Renaissance. When I say that I don't think the Renaissance existed, it's not that I think the period of time from kind of like the late 14th, 15th century onwards. I know that those years existed, and I know that the things that happened then. I just am skeptical about the way we group and describe and kind of put this name. Anyway, I'm not getting into that now, but just to say that it was from that kind of critical perspective that I wrote my essay, which explored Scotland and the Renaissance. Scotland obviously is in Europe, but certainly at this point it was very much on the peripheries of Europe, and very far from the supposed kind of birthplace of the Renaissance in Italy. So I essentially asked if the kind of framework of global history and this idea about a global Renaissance could be applied to Scotland, before then kind of briefly explaining that Scotland, like the rest of the world, doesn't need a Renaissance and should instead be approached on its own terms. This essay won me the greatest piece of feedback that I received from a professor, which was, "I think your examples are generally well chosen and carefully handled, and I like your judicious conclusion, gently consigning the Renaissance to the dustbin." Which, you know, the man wasn't wrong. Also in this semester 1 of year 2, I studied a course on medieval masculinity, and this class opened my eyes to a side of academia so expansive and curious that if the Daily Mail found out, they would stamp through the floor of the classroom like Rumpelstiltskin. The essence of the course was interrogating masculinity in medieval Western Europe. What did masculinity look like to different classes and communities? What kind of tensions were there between these prescriptive ideals of what men should do or be versus kind of the lived realities of different people? The discussions that took place around gender in this class were fair, open-minded, and kind of full of a good faith curiosity. In terms of content, we looked at the Crusades, we looked at mother-son and father-son relationships, we looked at monastic and clerical settings. The latter is especially poignant, as in the High Medieval period, priests and clerics, so religious men who weren't monks, that was like a separate thing, these priests and clerics were increasingly being expected to be celibate, which some argued caused a crisis of masculinity. For my essay, I considered whether religious and clerical masculinity could coexist with noble masculinity in this period, and my answer was basically that masculinity, then as now, is kind of whatever people want it to be. For example, the monastic writer William of Malmesbury, and there is about to be a whole lot of Williams, so strap in. William of Malmesbury celebrated the luxury of William the Conqueror's royal court as kind of befitting his status and part and parcel of his good rule, but he condemned the frivolity of the next king, William II or William Rufus, as emasculated and a sign of kind of decadence and poor governance. For William of Malmesbury, what was or wasn't masculine in this instance was not quite as relevant as the fact that he liked William I and he didn't like William II. Right, so I've just gone through some of the notes from my medieval masculinity essay and found the two passages by William of Malmesbury that I'm referring to here. So the first one regarding William the Conqueror says, "The dinners in which he, William the Conqueror, took part on the major festivals were costly and splendid. Christmas at Gloucester, Easter at Winchester, Whitsun at Westminster, and each of the years in which he was free to stay in England. All great men of whatever walk of life were summoned to them by royal edict, so that envoys from other nations might admire the large and brilliant company and the splendid luxury of the feast. Nor was he at any other season so courteous or so ready to oblige, so that foreign visitors might carry a lively report to every country of the generosity that matched his wealth." And then regarding William II or William Rufus, William of Malmesbury writes, "The knightly code of honour disappeared. Courtiers devoured the substance of the country people and engulfed their livelihood, taking the very food out of their mouths. Long flowing hair, luxurious garments, shoes with curved and pointed tips became the fashion. Softness of body rivaling the weaker sex, a mincing gait, effeminate gestures, and a liberal display of the person as they went along. Such was the ideal fashion of the younger men. Spineless, unmanned, they were reluctant to remain as nature had intended they should be. They were a menace to the virtue of others and promiscuous with their own. Troops of effeminates and gangs of wastrels went round with the court." So both of these passages reference kind of courtly splendour and like the luxury and opulence of the royal court, but one justifies it as part of good governance while the other condemns it as effeminate. Only one passage is kind of explicitly gendered on the face of it, which is obviously the passage about William Rufus. But good governance and kind of rationality were all traits considered masculine. So William is writing about the same topic, but holds one up as masculine and the other as emasculated. So yeah, as you were. And so he was able to kind of twist these gender norms accordingly. By the same token, clerics upon whom celibacy had been imposed successfully kind of recast these rules and strictures as a sign of truly masculine restraint and moderation, despite kind of sexual activity and sexual prowess being kind of a tenet of masculinity. This was definitely one of the most eye-opening courses that I took, and this essay did get my highest mark throughout my course, so that was validating. I just realised how big of a fucking tangent I just went on. Am I sorry? Yes, I am. My apologies. My final taught class in semester 2 of year 2 was Piety and Pilgrimage in late medieval Scotland. This class definitely spoke most to my kind of pre-existing interest, which was late medieval Scotland, and it explored various saints and their relationship to Scotland. So we looked at kind of local saints, both in Scotland and kind of in Ireland, and the crossover there. Scottish kind of veneration of virgin martyr saints like Catherine of Alexandria, political martyrs like Thomas Becket, crusading saints, dynastic saints, and pilgrimage. I chose to write my essay about St Margaret, the same St Margaret from earlier, and explored kind of her saintly legacy as it unfolded between her death in 1093 and the early 16th century. She was primarily a dynastic saint for the Stuart royals, and she eventually became one of Scotland's patron saints, so I focused on that. And finally, after all of those essays have been handed in, the dissertation period began with a due date in mid-August. The dissertation was the hardest part. We had to come up with a kind of initial idea, be allocated a supervisor on the basis of that idea, come up with a formal dissertation proposal to be approved by that supervisor, and then write the fucking thing. Genuinely, I don't know if I'm emotionally ready to process the dissertation. It was just so fucking hard. I didn't do an undergrad dissertation, which definitely hindered me slightly. I did manage to bring it back from the brink of disaster, but only just. And to be honest, I think I'd rather do a video just about the dissertation next spring, because then people will obviously be starting their dissertation process, and hopefully I will have recovered enough from the trauma to discuss mine. So for now, it is enough to know that I wrote about Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's elder sister, who married the King of Scots in 1503, and after being widowed in 1513, served as regent for the government of her infant son. And I looked at kind of the interplay between power and gender in Margaret's life. So after 2 years of solid studying, what did I actually learn? In a way, nothing. Come with me on this. The more advanced your study in history, it may be the same in other fields, but I do not know, having not studied those fields, the less content you are taught. It becomes all about skills. It's about understanding methodology and how to read and incorporate primary and secondary sources. I don't know if I specifically learned anything new about how you analyse primary and secondary sources. You know, you're kind of still asking the how, why, what, when, who, context, reading against the grain type of thing. But I definitely got a lot of practice. I definitely feel more confident in reading kind of academic works now, how to kind of command secondary literature and how to best mine it for information, following paper trails to try and find primary sources. They're not all handed to you like they might be in an undergrad. Like, you don't get a textbook. So being able to reverse engineer secondary work to find primary sources that are going to be useful becomes a really important skill to learn. For example, in my dissertation, there's an incident that gets talked about a lot of Margaret Tudor kind of railing at her husband and begging him not to go to war with England. He didn't listen, he then died. and a lot of kind of text quoted, like direct quotes of Margaret. Something she says, she's supposed to have said something like, are the cries of your infant son, like, don't they mean anything to you, blah blah blah. And there were texts that kind of quoted this as absolutely true. So I spent a fair few hours working backwards to try and find the source, and to find it came from this random guy in the 17th century. But somebody had obviously talked about it as if it was more legitimate in terms of scholarship, and then that was repeated. In the same kind of bracket, I got to grips with the special collections that we had at the university library. The weird thing about studying medieval history is there are texts which, in comparison to what you're studying, feel incredibly modern, but they are still old enough that you have to book to see them in a specialist collection, because they're still really, really delicate and fragile, like from the Victorian era, which to me, having spent so long kind of living in the 16th century, I'm like, what do you mean this was written in the 1890s? Why isn't it available at Waterstones? But yeah, generally it made me feel like a big grown-up historian doing big grown-up historian things. It was very exciting using the special collections for that reason. So I've talked about kind of methodology a lot, and one of the key fields of methodology that I feel a lot more invested in now is gender history. It's one of the very like widely applicable things that I learnt during my masters. I think I am very lucky to live in an era where women's history has become quite commonplace in the mainstream, but a lot of gender history is really pushing beyond that, pushing not only for like representation but towards a deeper analysis, rather than maybe an analysis that ends with, wow, go girl, queen pussy boss.
Holy shit, girl, queen pussy boss.
This definitely reflected with my Margaret Tudor study. Margaret doesn't usually fulfill the criteria for kind of a strong, badass female character, but she is still noteworthy and can offer much to gender history, just because her experience of her gender doesn't match maybe what we wish it did, like her being more subversive and kind of rebellious, or rebellious in ways that were feminist essentially, and she isn't much of that. You know, it's a good job that Shakespeare didn't write a play about Margaret Tudor, because if I went to go see it, like that woman went to go see that Richard III play, and then his apparition haunted her, like I just feel like me and Margaret would bicker. And like, I'm on her side. I'm telling everyone she's interesting, but I don't know, I don't think we would vibe. Possibly because I'm an anarchist, but definitely responsible for that kind of enhanced understanding of gender history was my medieval masculinity class. Masculinity in history can sometimes seem like the default, but I would disagree. Like, lots of the study of men does not kind of interrogate or try and unpick their masculinity. It takes it entirely for granted. Like, I'm sure there are definitely people talking about this in academia, but in the mainstream, like, when was the last time you heard about, I don't know, some like documentary about Winston Churchill that was asking like how he felt about being masculine, and kind of interactions perhaps in his like childhood with different figures, and whether that kind of affected how he perceived his like, it just, we don't get that. It's just like, oh, this was a bloke and he did X, Y and Z, and it's like, no, this is like, man is a gender too. My study of the medieval period was also kind of both broadened and deepened. It is deepened, it's definitely deepened. I've definitely studied kind of the late medieval period in Scotland, which, thanks to Mary de Guise, goes up to 1560. And I had done like early modern Europe as well, but I hadn't studied quite as far back before. St Margaret's kind of 11th century, and then Radegund of Poitiers was 6th century, so it pushed me back a little bit. And certainly with the high medieval period, I definitely feel a lot more confident about it. And kind of up to the late medieval period. I also ended up studying medieval saints a lot. By chance, I wrote 3 essays about saints. I wrote about Radegund once and St Margaret of Scotland twice. I think she gets a brief mention in my Renaissance one as well, so twice in a bit. if you have studied history in the UK or kind of northwestern Europe generally, it is a given that you will end up studying the Reformation. So I did kind of have the jump on saints as they figure so significantly in the Reformation, but regardless of this familiarity, I've definitely come away with a much deeper understanding of sainthood kind of throughout the medieval period, particularly female saints. The last thing I learned, it's going to get a little bit sentimental if you don't mind, but I learned how much I love history, which just sounds very twee and stupid. When I first started at the Open Uni, I was studying English literature, so I don't think I ever saw myself holding one undergrad and one postgrad degree in history of all things. To be honest, I thought that I hated studying and academia and anything like that, but it turned out I just hated school. Studying at both undergraduate and postgraduate level has been the most rewarding thing I've ever done. The growth that I have achieved, the advancement in my skills is far bigger than I could have dreamed, and I am so glad that I've done it. It was a fucking uphill battle. There were so many moments when the wheels almost fell off, which is a very apt metaphor, but I think my passion sustained me. Passion and spite and grit and Deliveroo from Pepe's Piri Piri in Edinburgh. I'm very grateful that I was given and was able to seize the opportunity to do postgraduate study, and if it's something that you are considering, that you are able to do, then I cannot recommend it enough. I can give you 3 pieces of advice. One which you won't do, one which you might not be able to do, and one which you can't afford not to. If you've got compulsory modules that you like 100% know that you will be studying, you can try and get hold of the reading list and make a start, or at least pretend that you're going to. You're never going to know which of those items are going to be absolutely pivotal versus the ones that are a complete waste of time. But I would say, if you can, maybe read over the introductions. Next, if you are able, visit the city or the campus that you've chosen. There are obviously like planned open days, but if you can't do those times, if you get in touch, they probably will be able to send someone to show you around. This obviously isn't possible for everybody for a range of reasons, but maybe get familiar with the general layout of the city. To be honest, that's why Google Maps was invented. I was very lucky that I had been to Edinburgh many times before, and if I hadn't, I probably wouldn't have chosen Edinburgh. I wasn't super familiar with where the actual university campus is, so yeah, there was some heavy Google mapping, street view going on. Finally, nurture your passion. This is the most efficient use of your time, because no matter what, your passion will be what sustains you. So for now, watch films, read books, listen to podcasts, follow me on Instagram. Just cultivate that joy and love for your subjects, because without that, all the motivation and drive in the world will not sustain you. I don't know what the future will hold for me, academically or otherwise, but if you have any questions about masters or undergraduate study, or even kind of school study, I didn't do a history A-level, and I was right not to. I've been a student for the past 8 years, so if you have any questions about any level of study, then you can either comment below or you can get in touch on my socials, which will be in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time. Yeah.